The cold hit first. Not the kind that just makes you shiver for a second, but the kind that crawls into your boots and stays there. Like winter itself is trying to slow you down. Every breath came out in thin white clouds, hanging in the air just long enough to remind the men how quiet everything had gotten. Too quiet. The kind of silence soldiers learn to distrust. Somewhere deep in enemy territory, a small group of American infantry moved carefully through a tree line, boots crunching softly over frozen leaves and patches of mud. They hadn't slept much in 2 days. Their uniforms were stiff with sweat and dirt, faces smudged with grime, eyes red from constant watchfulness. The war had shrunk their world down to the next step, the next shadow, the next sound. A few hours earlier, they'd been laughing. One of the guys had joked about the terrible coffee back at camp, swearing he'd trade his rifle for a hot cup and a real bed. Someone else teased him about a girl waiting back home in Ohio. For a moment, they weren't soldiers. They were just kids again. Brothers. Normal. But that's how war tricks you. It gives you 10 seconds of normal, then rips it away. Their radio had gone dead first. Then the distant artillery stopped. No birds. No wind. Just that heavy, unnatural stillness pressing down on everything. Their sergeant raised a fist. Everyone froze. They listened. At first, nothing. Then, faint. Boots. Not theirs. More than a few. Moving fast. Before anyone could react, the crack of a rifle shattered the quiet. Dirt kicked up near their feet. Another shot split through the trees. Contact. Someone yelled, and suddenly the forest exploded into chaos. Men dove behind logs and rocks, firing blindly toward flashes of gray uniforms weaving between trunks. But it didn't last long. They were outnumbered. Badly. Ammo ran low fast. One by one, rifles clicked empty. The sound every soldier hates. The sound that means you're out of options. Fall back. The sergeant shouted, but there was nowhere to go. More German troops closed in from the sides, cutting off every escape. It was a trap, clean and tight. Smoke drifted through the trees. Shouts in German echoed closer. Boots surrounded them from all directions. Then came the command they never wanted to hear. Drop your weapons. Quote. For a second, nobody moved. Pride. Fear. Anger. All tangled together. But you can't fight bullets with empty hands. One rifle hit the ground. Then another. Metal clattered against frozen earth like little admissions of defeat. Hands slowly went up. Hearts pounded so loud it felt like everyone could hear them. German soldiers stepped forward, rifles trained, faces hard and unreadable. They kicked the Americans' weapons away, searched their pockets, shoved them into a rough line. That's when the reality set in. This wasn't a firefight anymore. They weren't soldiers at that moment. They were prisoners. And standing there, surrounded by enemies, wrists shaking from cold and adrenaline, one young American stared at the ground and thought about home. About how just this morning he'd been joking with his buddies, never imagining that before the day ended, he'd be looking straight into the face of death itself. They stood there in a crooked line, hands raised, fingers stiff from the cold and from something worse than the cold. Fear has a way of locking your joints, like your own body is trying to turn you into stone. Nobody spoke. Nobody dared. The only sounds were boots crunching through frost and the sharp, clipped German voices barking orders back and forth. It's strange how time slows down when you realize you might not make it out of a moment alive. Seconds stretch. Breaths feel heavy. Every little detail burns into your memory. The Americans avoided eye contact, staring at the ground or straight ahead, trying not to give the enemy the satisfaction of seeing panic. One of them swallowed hard, another quietly muttered a prayer under his breath. Someone's teeth chattered, and it wasn't just from the weather. German soldiers moved down the line, checking dog tags, shoving shoulders, stripping away anything useful. Rough hands. No gentleness. These weren't guards yet. They were conquerors. Then an officer stepped forward. You could tell immediately he was in charge. Cleaner uniform. Sharper posture. Calm in a way that only someone completely in control can be. He studied the prisoners like they were objects. Not people, like he was deciding what to do with broken equipment. His eyes landed on one soldier near the middle of the line. The same young American who'd been joking hours earlier. Mud on his jacket. A small tear in his sleeve. Just a regular kid from back home, the kind you'd pass on the street and never think twice about. The officer walked straight up to him. Stopped. Close enough to smell the smoke on his coat. He said something in German, low and cold. The soldier didn't understand the words, but he understood the tone. It didn't matter what language you spoke. A threat sounds the same everywhere. Then came the click. A pistol being drawn. Slow. Deliberate. Every head turned. The barrel pressed against the American's temple. For a second, the entire world seemed to hold its breath. This was it. Everyone knew it. This wasn't intimidation anymore. This was an example. The officer wanted to break them, to show the others exactly how powerless they were. The soldier's heart hammered so hard it felt like it might crack his ribs. He could feel the cold metal against his skin, steady and unforgiving. One twitch of that finger and everything. His home, his family, every dumb joke with his buddies. Gone. And something inside him just snapped. Not fear. Not anger. Something almost absurd. Because the whole situation felt unreal. After everything they'd survived. The marches, the shells, the nights without sleep. This was how it ended? Standing in the mud while some officer tried to scare him? It almost felt ridiculous. A small sound slipped out of him. At first, the guys next to him thought he was choking. Then they realized. He was laughing. Soft at first. Then louder. Not hysterical. Not begging. Just this calm, defiant chuckle like he'd just heard the world's worst joke. The officer frowned, confused. The Americans stared. Who laughs with a gun to their head? The soldier lifted his eyes. Looked that officer dead in the face. And with a crooked little grin said, clear as day, come get me. Quote. No trembling. No cracking voice. Just pure, stubborn refusal to be afraid. And in that instant, something shifted. The Germans didn't see a prisoner anymore. They saw a man who wouldn't bend. And the other Americans, watching this kid stare down death like it was nothing, felt their own fear loosen its grip. Just a little, because somehow, unbelievably, one laugh had taken the power back. For a second after he said it, nobody moved. It was like the whole forest forgot how to breathe. The officer's pistol was still pressed against his head. But now there was something different in the air. Confusion. Annoyance. Maybe even a flicker of respect he didn't want to show. Because this wasn't how it was supposed to go. Prisoners were supposed to plead. Shake. Beg. That's how power worked. But this kid had just laughed in his face. The officer lowered the gun slightly, studying him like he was trying to solve a puzzle. Then he shoved him back into line instead of pulling the trigger. And just like that, he was still alive. It didn't feel real. The Americans were marched out of the woods at gunpoint. Boots slipping through mud and frost, hands still raised or tied. No one talked much, but everything had changed. A few minutes ago, they'd felt small, defeated, already halfway ghosts. Now there was this strange, quiet energy passing between them. Guys who had been staring at the ground were standing a little straighter. One of them even smirked. Because they'd all seen it. They'd all heard it. That laugh. That simple, stubborn, come get me. Quote. It was reckless. Maybe even crazy. But it reminded them of something they'd almost forgotten out there behind enemy lines. They were still Americans. Still fighters. Still human. The enemy could take their weapons. Their freedom, maybe even their lives, but they didn't automatically get their spirit. That part had to be given up. And he hadn't given up a thing. The days that followed weren't easy. Long marches. Rough camps. Cold nights with barely any food. The kind of exhaustion that sinks into your bones. But every time things got bad, someone would nudge him and whisper, hey, you gonna laugh at them again? And it would crack this tiny smile across his face. It became a running joke. Then a story. Then almost a legend inside that small group. New prisoners would hear it. This guy? German officer put a pistol to his head. He laughed. And people would glance at him like he was 10 feet tall. Even though he looked like the most ordinary guy in the world. That's the thing, though. He wasn't special. Not a movie hero. Not some fearless machine. He still got scared. Still missed home. Still wondered if he'd make it out. But in that one moment, when it counted most, he chose dignity over fear. And sometimes that's all courage really is. One decision. Months later. When the war finally shifted and liberation came. When gates opened and familiar uniforms appeared through the dust. He walked out thinner, tired, older in the eyes, but alive. He went home like millions of others, didn't brag, didn't turn it into some grand speech. If anything, he shrugged it off like it was nothing. Just something that happened. But the men who were there never forgot. At reunions, years down the road, they'd still tell it the same way. Remember that time you laughed in that officer's face? And they'd all laugh again, older now, grateful. Because history books talk about battles and generals and maps. They don't always talk about moments like that. One cold day. One pistol. One stubborn kid who refused to be afraid. But sometimes, it's those tiny, human flashes of defiance that define a lifetime and remind the rest of us what courage really looks like.